I didn't plan on starting my Saturday morning by calling a tow truck and a bulldozer, but then again, I didn't plan on Karen either. I just finished my coffee and was about to head out to feed the horses when I saw it. A white Audi Q7, parked diagonally across my gate like it was auditioning for a luxury car commercial on trespassed property. It was angled so perfectly wrong that even Houdini couldn't have backed out my truck. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, staring at it, waiting for some rational explanation to materialize out of thin air. None came. Just the Audi, gleaming in the sun like it belonged there, like it owned the place. I knew exactly whose car it was. Karen, real name Kendra, lived 4 houses down in the HOA's prized McMansion, a temple to marble countertops and oversized wreaths. She ran the HOA's Aesthetic Integrity Committee, like a suburban warlord. Her offenses ranged from issuing a citation for my mailbox being too rustic to attempting to fine my neighbor for hanging a hammock in their own backyard. She'd recently appointed herself party coordinator for the neighborhood's summer social calendar, which, apparently, gave her the right to treat private driveways like valet zones. I walked down the gravel drive, out onto the street, and turned the corner toward the community park. Sure enough, there was a bounce house, folding chairs, a table filled with sparkling wine, and a bunch of overly dressed neighbors milling about like they were attending a suburban version of the Met Gala. And there she was, Karen herself, wrapped in a blinding turquoise sundress with rhinestones, clutching a clipboard like it was a royal scepter. I approached with the calm of a man who had already decided that diplomacy had expired. "Hey Karen," I said, "there's an Audi blocking my gate." "Yours?" She blinked like I'd spoken in Swahili. Then smiled that patronizing, HOA smile. "Oh that? Yes. We didn't have enough parking by the park, and your place was so close and rustic. We thought no one would mind. It's just for a few hours." "Right," I said. "Except I mind. I've got livestock to tend, a feed delivery on the way, and a gate blocked by a very expensive SUV." She waved a hand like she was swatting away a fly. "It's not like you're using it right now. Just relax. It's a party. You should come by later. We've got sangria and a harpist." I stared at her, deadpan. "Move the car." She sighed, deep, dramatic for the audience. "Well, I can't leave the party right now. And my husband's golfing. It's locked anyway. Just give us until sunset." I could have argued, yelled, threatened to call the HOA board. But I'd tried all that before. This wasn't the first Karen incident. But it would be the last. I turned around, walked back home, and made 2 phone calls. One to a towing company I'd dealt with before when a camper trailer got abandoned by my fence. The other to a buddy who owed me a favor and owned heavy machinery. By the time the tow truck rolled up, a small group of neighbors had gathered with wine glasses and popcorn. I told the driver to back in through my side pasture, bypassing the gate entirely. He grinned like a kid on Christmas when he saw the Audi. "You sure?" he asked, half laughing. "Oh, I'm sure. Hook her up." But before he could even lower the boom, a scream ripped through the air. Karen was charging down the street, high heels sinking into the asphalt like tiny lawn stakes. Her rhinestone dress was flapping in the wind like a signal flag. She looked like an outraged peacock on a mission. "You can't tow my car," she shrieked. "That's illegal. This is an HOA neighborhood." "You blocked my private gate," I said flatly. "I've got security footage, timestamps, and about a dozen witnesses. You didn't give proper notice. There are procedures. You're on my land. You don't get procedures." She looked like she might actually combust on the spot. Her face went purple. Her eyes darted between me, the truck, and the growing audience of neighbors now filming with their phones. She spun to the tow driver. "Touch that car and I'll sue." The driver shrugged. "He's got legal right. You can call the cops if you want." She did. Of course. But when the sheriff's deputy showed up 20 minutes later, he took one look at the footage I played from my security app and said the magic words. "You're on his property, ma'am. He's within his rights. Karen let out a screech I think only dogs could fully hear. The tow truck began winching the Audi up, inch by inch. She tried to climb onto the ramp. The deputy stopped her. She tried bribing the driver. No luck. She then tried accusing me of harassment, but the deputy just gave her that tired cop face like he'd heard this exact script too many times before. The Audi was hauled off to the impound yard, and I went back to feeding the horses with a smile on my face and half the neighborhood cheering from their driveways. But I knew Karen. This wasn't over. She wasn't going to let something like being objectively wrong or public embarrassment stop her. No, she was going to escalate, and boy did she. 2 days later, I got a notice in the mail. A formal HOA complaint citing me for unauthorized equipment operation and creating an unsafe environment by use of commercial machinery within a residential zone. The letter was co-signed by Karen and 3 of her cronies. It demanded a $1,200 fine and a hearing in front of the HOA board. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. They were coming at me for towing a trespassing vehicle on my own property. But that wasn't the real kicker. That evening, I checked my security cams again. And there she was, Karen, in a hoodie and yoga pants, skulking around my fence like a raccoon on parole. She was trying to staple something to one of my trees. I zoomed in on the footage. It was a sign that read, "Hostile neighbor, proceed with caution." I checked the HOA bylaws. Nowhere did it say a neighbor could defame you on your own land. But that didn't matter to her. She wasn't operating within reason. This was ego warfare now. And I don't lose those. I took screenshots, printed the footage, started a file. Then I called someone who'd been waiting years to bring Karen down. The former HOA president. The one Karen had railroaded into resignation last year with some very questionable vote counting. Turns out, he had a lot to say and a lot of documentation. I smiled as I stapled the first few pages to the back of my own clipboard. The war had officially begun. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted precision. Karen played her games loud and public, but I preferred the long fuse. My plan was less about vengeance and more about restoring a sense of sanity, and if that meant a little public humiliation along the way, well, call it a bonus. The day after her bogus HOA citation, I spent the morning going through the bylaw handbook. I'd had a copy printed years ago, complete with every amendment. Karen never thought anyone actually read it. That was her first mistake. Her second was leaving a paper trail of every violation she'd ever leveraged against others while ignoring the ones she committed herself. The former HOA president, Alan, was a wealth of knowledge and bitterness. The man used to run the HOA like a decent, fair-minded steward until Karen ran a smear campaign about lack of decorum and failing community values. What she really meant was that he didn't ban colored flower pots or force elderly neighbors to repaint their porch rails. Karen and her clipboard mafia pushed him out in a single election. But Alan? He wasn't just licking his wounds. He'd kept records, logs, screenshots, HOA meeting recordings, and now that I'd brought him into the fold, he sent them to me by the gigabyte. "You're the first person who's actually stood up to her," he told me on the phone. "She doesn't know what to do with that. You're messing with her sense of power." "Perfect," I said. "Let's see how she handles losing it." Meanwhile, Karen was turning my existence into a bureaucratic obstacle course. She had the HOA board send me daily notices. Tiny, idiotic things. My trash bins were placed too early. My fence had a non-compliant wood grain. My wind chimes were audibly disruptive. My chickens were congregating suspiciously. It would have been comical if she weren't actually trying to build a legal case. But what she didn't know was that every complaint she filed was strengthening mine. I cataloged everything, matched her dates to my security footage, screen-captured emails, recorded her walking her dog off-leash through my pasture again. Then I pulled the trigger on Phase 2. See, Karen had this idea that the HOA had jurisdiction over every square inch of the neighborhood. But my property was never officially folded into the HOA. The land had been annexed decades ago as part of an agricultural easement and was technically exempt unless I signed a voluntary compliance agreement, which I never did. The previous board knew this. Karen clearly didn't. So I hired a lawyer, not to sue, but to deliver a very formal cease and desist letter citing property law, easement history, and jurisdictional overreach. We mailed it, emailed it, and had it hand-delivered via courier wearing a navy blue suit, just to add spice. When Karen got it, she stormed into an emergency HOA meeting and demanded they revoke my community privileges, which again, I didn't have. She might as well have tried to exile me from Mars. Her rage was nuclear. The very next day, she had 2 contractors show up to evaluate my front hedges for violation of Community Landscape Code. They weren't even wearing uniforms, just 2 confused guys in a beat-up van. I asked them who hired them, and one said, some lady named Karen. Paid us $100 cash to take pictures of bushes. I sent them away with lemonade and a laugh. That night, Karen escalated to something almost beautiful in its stupidity. She decided to retaliate by throwing another party. This time, it was a neighborhood unity potluck, and she positioned the buffet table right in front of my pasture gate, again. But this time, she didn't block it with her car. No, she was sneakier. She parked her brand-new Audi. Same model, just black, in front of the gate on the inside, having driven across the grass through an open-access road that ran between properties. That was when I knew she wasn't just petty, she was bold. I stood there staring at the car like I was watching a toddler try to rewrite the Constitution in crayon. It was parked between 2 fence posts like it was being protected from a hurricane. Guests were already arriving. Lawn chairs were arranged. Children were playing tag. There was a damn ice cream cart. And there was Karen, standing next to a speaker, acting like she hadn't just invaded private property to throw what was essentially a trespassing festival. I didn't walk over this time. I just stood at my fence and watched. Waited. 5 minutes later, my buddy Mark pulled up with his flatbed trailer hauling exactly what I'd requested, a bulldozer. A bright yellow, 14-ton, gently used piece of road-clearing magnificence. He parked it beside my barn, gave me a nod, and asked one question. You want gentle or dramatic? Dramatic, I said, climbing up onto the rig. I started the engine, and the whole machine roared to life like the gods had just cleared their throat. Neighbors turned their heads. Karen froze mid-sentence. I drove slowly, casually, like I was heading to mow the lawn. The blade wasn't even down yet. When I reached the gate, I paused. Just long enough to lock eyes with Karen across the yard. Then I hit the lever and dropped the blade. The bulldozer tore through the makeshift lawn setup like Moses parting the Red Sea. Chairs flew. Paper plates lifted. A jello mold did a double somersault. I angled slightly and grazed the Audi's front bumper. Not enough to crush, just enough to leave a love tap of steel and hydraulic pressure that crumpled it like foil. Then I backed up, turned, and drove around the other side. The guests were running by then. Kids were squealing with glee like it was a parade float. The ice cream guy took cover behind his cart. And Karen was frozen like someone had unplugged her brain. I stopped the bulldozer, stepped down, and shouted, "Just reclaiming my access, folks. Shouldn't take more than a minute." The applause started slow. One of the dads gave a fist pump. A woman on the HOA landscaping subcommittee openly cheered. Someone actually tossed me a soda. Karen screamed, "You're insane. You destroyed my car. You're going to jail for this." "Didn't touch your car," I said. "Barely brushed it. You've got 3 cameras pointing right at it. Get out of that bulldozer right now. I'm on my property. So technically, I never left it." She stormed off toward her house, muttering about lawsuits and restraining orders and criminal mischief. Meanwhile, I pulled out my phone, opened the security footage, and added another entry to the folder labeled Karen, Exhibit B. 2 days later, I was summoned to a special HOA hearing. Karen sat at the head of the table, smug, arms folded, like she'd finally cornered me. Her motion was to permanently bar me from participating in any community-sponsored activity and to fine me $3,000 for property damage, threatening behavior, and disrupting communal harmony. I handed the board copies of my easement paperwork, legal counsel statements, and a notarized letter from the sheriff's department confirming that the bulldozer incident occurred on land I fully owned and controlled. I also included the footage of Karen's car parked on my pasture and her earlier attempt to smear me with signs. Then, I did the most Karen thing imaginable. I moved to file a countermotion. My motion was to remove Karen from her position as head of the Aesthetic Integrity Committee for abuse of power, malicious prosecution, and consistent community disruption. The vote passed 4-1. Karen's face didn't change. It collapsed. She stood silently, clipboard shaking in her hands, eyes wide in disbelief. For the first time in forever, she had nothing to say. And I wasn't even close to done. Karen wasn't just angry now, she was humiliated. And people like her, people who build their entire self-worth on control and perception, don't handle public defeat quietly. After the board voted to remove her from the Aesthetic Integrity Committee, I half expected her to rage quit and start plotting in private. But no, Karen went nuclear in broad daylight. The very next morning, my mailbox was smashed to pieces. Not kicked or dented, obliterated. It looked like someone had taken a bat to it in a fit of rage. And taped to the crumpled metal was a handwritten note in pink glitter gel pen that read, "Maybe now you'll follow community guidelines." Cute. I didn't bother calling the cops. I knew she'd deny it. I knew it wouldn't stick. Instead, I installed a new mailbox, made of reinforced steel and mounted in concrete like I was expecting a siege. Then I posted a picture of it to the neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, "Upgraded to HOA grade durability. Thanks for the inspiration." I didn't tag her. I didn't have to. Within an hour, she'd replied with a passive-aggressive comment about how vandalism is tragic, but some people just provoke it. Half the comments lit up defending me. That's when I knew the tides were really turning. I used to think everyone tolerated Karen because they were afraid of her, but now I realized they were just waiting for someone else to start the rebellion. And I'd become the reluctant leader of the HOA resistance. Over the next week, Karen's descent into desperation became a neighborhood sideshow. First, she tried to rally the board to reinstate her by circulating a petition door to door. It didn't go well. She only got 2 signatures, her husband's and one from her equally unhinged best friend who thought the HOA should ban overgrown basil gardens because they attract bees. When that didn't work, she sent out a mass email accusing the board of colluding with aggressive anti-community forces, which sounded more like a QAnon post than HOA drama. But it wasn't all entertainment. She still had claws, and she was looking for fresh ways to dig them in. That's when she filed a noise complaint with the county, claiming I was running unlicensed industrial machinery on my property. The bulldozer incident had rattled her more than I realized. According to the report, she claimed I was operating construction equipment daily, disturbing the peace and violating zoning laws. The county inspector showed up 2 days later in a dusty sedan and a sun-faded clipboard. He was polite enough, said he had to follow up due to multiple anonymous complaints. I showed him around, let him inspect the barn, the pasture, the feed shed. There was no bulldozer. There never had been, officially. It had been borrowed, briefly, and returned to its legal owner. No commercial work, no industrial project. Just a small farm and a man trying to live in peace. The inspector nodded, jotted some notes, and told me I'd likely hear nothing more about it. Before he left, he said, "You know, I've had 3 complaints about you in the last 2 weeks. From the same person. And they're all nonsense." "Let me guess," I said. "Turquoise dress, clipboard, deeply invested in the moral fabric of birdbath placement?" He laughed. "Sounds about right." That's when I realized Karen wasn't just annoying. She was making enemies in every office that mattered. I spent that night putting together my favorite kind of project. Petty but legal. I knew Karen loved her property. She spent a fortune on landscaping, lighting, a koi pond, and one of those outdoor speaker systems that plays generic instrumental jazz on loop. She also had a fancy new garden arbor right on the edge of her property, a decorative structure with a little brick path underneath, flanked by rose bushes and fairy lights. What she didn't realize was that the arbor extended 2 feet into the public sidewalk easement. Technically, the city owned that strip of land, and Karen had built right over it without a permit. I confirmed it with the city's GIS mapping tool, took photos, then filed a complaint using the same reporting portal she'd used against me. I submitted every form, every measurement, and every supporting document. 2 days later, a city code enforcement officer showed up and slapped a bright orange notice on her arbor. Unauthorized structure on public right-of way. Remove within 14 days. I watched from my porch with a glass of lemonade as Karen discovered the notice. She stood frozen for several seconds, then tried to rip it down with trembling hands. But the glue was industrial grade and tore off in little bits, flaking into the wind. She stomped back inside like the ground had personally betrayed her. The next day, she had landscapers removing the arbor in full view of the entire street. I nodded at the crew as they worked. One of them grinned and said, "She told us she's being harassed by a criminal mastermind." I raised my glass. "Tell her he says hi." At this point, Karen's behavior reached new levels of theatrical. She started wearing oversized sunglasses everywhere like she was a fallen starlet dodging paparazzi. She refused to walk her dog past my house and sent her husband instead. Poor guy looked like he aged 5 years in a week. And then came the coup de grace. She tried to run for HOA president. I thought it was a joke when I saw her campaign flyer in my mailbox. It had a stock photo of a handshake, a picture of her smiling in front of a tulip arrangement, and a slogan that read, "Restoring order, reclaiming integrity." Beneath that, in fine print, was a bullet list of all the disruptions caused by unsanctioned residents who had weaponized equipment and exploited legal loopholes. That was me. So I decided to run against her. I hadn't intended to. I never cared about the HOA's political circus. But when I saw that flyer, when I realized she was trying to grab the gavel after being publicly removed, I knew I had to stop her. Not with bulldozers or lawyers, but with the one thing she feared most: legitimacy. My campaign slogan? Let's just chill. I printed 100 flyers with a picture of my dog, a hammock, and a bullet list of things I promised not to do. I promised not to fine anyone for the color of their garage door, not to inspect their yard gnomes, not to hold surprise parties on their land, and definitely not to accuse their chickens of loitering. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors I barely knew came up to me at the grocery store to shake my hand. A retired couple 3 houses down baked me cookies. The woman who Karen once yelled at for hanging Halloween decorations too early actually cried and said, "We thought we were stuck with her forever." Election night came. The votes were counted in the clubhouse under the supervision of a third-party volunteer, one of the teens who ran the summer pool stand. And when the results were announced, it wasn't even close. I won by a landslide. Out of 76 ballots, I got 62. Karen got 8. 6 were spoiled, one with "Karen must be stopped" scrawled across the middle in red ink. She didn't show up to concede. She didn't even open her door when I dropped off the official notice. Instead, the very next day, her house went up for sale. Just like that. No warning. No goodbye. Just a neatly placed sign and a flurry of real estate agents parading strangers through her personal kingdom. I heard she's moving to a gated community across town. A place with stricter standards, according to the listing. I wish them luck. They're going to need it. Karen may have packed up her rhinestone sundresses and left, but the wreckage she left behind didn't vanish with the moving van. Like any authoritarian regime, even a suburban one, the end of the tyrant doesn't automatically mean peace. It means cleanup. It means reorganizing the rubble of passive-aggressive policies and healing wounds left by years of citation warfare. And somehow, despite only ever wanting to be left alone, I'd ended up at the center of it all. The week after Karen's exit felt like the morning after a tornado. Everyone was still in shock, cautiously optimistic, but deeply confused about what came next. I was now, officially, the HOA president. And the neighborhood, once ruled by fear of fines for unregulated mulch texture, was looking to me for guidance. Which was hilarious, considering that 3 months ago, my biggest neighborhood contribution was telling people where to find the cheapest hay. But I took the job seriously. Not out of ambition, but because I knew what would happen if I didn't. Another Karen would rise. Some lesser clipboard zealot would step in and fill the vacuum with pastel tyranny. So I assembled a team: Alan, the former president, now reinstated as treasurer; Claudia from 2 doors down, who once received a citation for unauthorized hammock use, now vice president; and a quiet high school senior named Rachel, who ran the summer pool stand and had more common sense than the last 3 committees combined. Our first mission was to rewrite the bylaws. Not the whole book, just the parts Karen had inflated like a deranged balloon artist. We struck down over 30 micro-regulations. Gone were the clauses banning seasonal wreaths, limiting the number of visible garden gnomes, and prohibiting outdoor string lights except during approved celebratory periods. We held a vote to eliminate the Aesthetics Committee entirely. It passed unanimously. I gave everyone a small American flag and declared the yard decoration wars officially over. As we rolled back the madness, something surprising happened. The neighborhood came alive. People started talking to each other again. There were porch hangouts, impromptu BBQs, even a driveway movie night hosted by the same couple Karen once tried to fine for projecting a kids' movie onto their garage. The place had a pulse, a soul. It felt like a community again. And that's when the letter arrived. A thick envelope, hand-delivered to my door in an elegant blue folder. At first, I thought it was another complaint, maybe a straggler from Karen's reign of terror. But no, this was worse. Much worse. It was a notice from the County Zoning Commission. It stated that a formal complaint had been filed regarding the improper use of agricultural land within a residential area. My property. The allegation claimed that I was operating a commercial facility disguised as a private farm, and that I was in violation of noise, structure, and access ordinances. The complaint was anonymous, but the language? The phrasing? It screamed Karen. And if she hadn't filed it herself, she'd definitely inspired it before skipping town. I read it twice. Then again. It was full of vague accusations backed by twisted interpretations of legal code. There were references to unlicensed animal housing, commercial-grade equipment on residential terrain, and, my favorite, unmitigated pasture exposure to community lines of sight. Translation? Someone didn't like looking at my horses. I drove straight to the county office the next morning with a file the size of a small novel. Ownership records, easement maps, permit history. Even aerial photos dating back 20 years showing my barn, my fence, my tractor. I met with a zoning officer named Greg, who looked like he'd rather be doing anything else but smiled politely as I laid out my case. Halfway through my presentation, he nodded and said, "Honestly, this looks airtight. But the board still has to hold a hearing. Standard protocol." "Let me guess," I said. "In 30 days?" "2 weeks," he replied. "We had a cancellation." I thanked him and walked out, already planning my next move. Because even if I had the facts, I knew how this worked. Bureaucracy doesn't care about logic. Cares about optics. About presentation. And whoever filed this complaint, Karen's ghost or otherwise, was trying to create a narrative that I was a law-flouting menace hiding a tractor empire behind my barn door. So I changed the narrative. I spent the next 12 days turning my property into the most regulation-compliant slice of Americana imaginable. I installed new signage, private agricultural use zoned and permitted. I painted my barn, mowed the pastures in a crisscross checkerboard pattern, and hosted an open barn tour where neighbors could meet my chickens and learn the names of my horses. I invited the local elementary school for a field trip. I even printed little coloring books with farm safety tip. The day of the hearing arrived and I showed up in clean boots, a pressed button-down, and a binder that looked like it belonged in a corporate merger. The hearing room was a dull gray box with a long table, 4 zoning officials, and one very familiar face seated near the back row. Karen. She wasn't supposed to be there. She didn't live in the county anymore. But she wasn't sitting quietly, either. She was whispering to a man in a navy sport coat, mid-50s, over-gelled hair, eyes that didn't blink. He looked like a real estate lawyer who moonlighted as a vampire. I caught enough of their conversation to realize exactly what had happened. Karen had sold her house to a developer friend who was now trying to get the surrounding properties, mine included, flagged for code violations. If they could get enough owners to fold, they'd buy up the land cheap, bulldoze the lots, and build luxury mini-mansions for the next wave of HOA victims. I wasn't just being harassed. I was being targeted. When the board called me up, I kept my cool. I laid out the documentation, explained the land's zoning classification, presented photos of my property from every decade since 1983. I even brought in Greg, the zoning officer, who corroborated everything I said. But the lawyer tried to twist it. He claimed the presence of guests at the barn tour proved commercial use. He called my tractor excessively industrial. He even implied that my pasture presented a visual safety hazard to the surrounding homes. Would you say, he asked, that your use of this property increases tension in the neighborhood? I paused, looked him square in the face. I'd say my use of this property increases livestock. And frankly, that's more productive than most HOA meetings. A few snickers broke out in the room. The lawyer sat down, lips tight. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. The board deliberated for 10 minutes. Then they ruled in my favor. Unanimously. The zoning complaint was dismissed. My property was reaffirmed as a compliant agricultural parcel with historic precedent. Any future complaints would require substantial new evidence to be considered. Karen stormed out without a word. But I wasn't done. Back at home, I called the local paper. The same one that ran blurbs on HOA events and ribbon cuttings. I pitched them a story. Local farm wins zoning battle against corporate developer. They bit. The article ran with a full photo spread of my horses, my barn, the kids from the school trip, and even one of me standing next to a goat named Pickles. The story caught traction. Within a week, it was shared in local Facebook groups, featured on the paper's front page, and turned me into a minor neighborhood folk hero. More importantly, it scared off the developer. He pulled out of the pending purchase. The land stayed in private hands. The ghost of Karen's influence finally began to evaporate. But as much as I wanted to celebrate, I had one more move to make. Because I'd found something buried deep in the records Karen never thought anyone would check. And it was going to end this saga once and for all. It started with a file folder labeled Emergency Drainage District Proposal, tucked in the back of a dusty HOA storage bin in Alan's garage. He'd been keeping the old HOA archives ever since Karen commandeered the boardroom and digitized everything, except the things she didn't want others to find. We were reorganizing files for the new board when he handed it to me with a look. "This is the thing she pitched 2 years ago," he said. It got shut down fast. No one ever followed up. She was furious. Inside was a proposal to reroute the neighborhood drainage system through my property. Karen had pitched it as a flood mitigation upgrade for the community, but it wasn't that at all. She'd tried to get a special assessment passed to dig a shallow culvert right across my land, effectively turning a chunk of my pasture into a runoff zone. Her plan didn't mention my name directly, but the map made it clear. The culvert would have sliced through my back field like a scar. The proposal had been shelved, but Karen's notes were still in the margins, frustrated scribbles like "find workaround" and "push through with new board." I realized then, everything she'd done, the complaints, the citations, the parties, the fake fines, even the zoning attack, was part of one long game to make me give up that land. Because if I gave it up, she could revive her drainage plan, sell the concept to developers, and cash in. She hadn't been a nuisance out of boredom. She'd been playing chess. But unfortunately for her, so had I. The next day, I took that file down to the county clerk's office and requested the public easement record. Sure enough, Karen had tried twice to initiate changes that would have required eminent domain usage under a special infrastructure clause. Both times quietly, both times denied. I also noticed something else. When she sold her house, she hadn't just sold it to a developer. She'd done it through a shell company, a quiet LLC transfer. And that company had listed her as a managing partner just 2 months earlier. She hadn't just sold her home. She'd sold it to herself under a different name so she could stay involved in future development plans without anyone realizing. She was gone, but she wasn't done. Not until I made her be. That night, I called a friend of mine, Reggie, who worked in investigative real estate compliance. He owed me a favor from an old business deal, and I cashed it in with interest. "You think she violated disclosure laws?" he asked. "I think she created a company to bypass community sale restrictions, hid it from the HOA board, and used that position to manipulate zoning pressures." Reggie whistled. "If that's true, she could lose the property, maybe even face fraud charges." "Good," I said. "Let's find out." While Reggie started digging, I hosted a public town hall for the neighborhood. Not just HOA members, everyone. I called it "The Future of Our Block," and served lemonade, barbecue, and locally grown vegetables. I gave a short speech under the shade of my barn's lean-to, nothing grandiose, just calm, clear words about property rights, community trust, and how development pressure had nearly turned our little neighborhood into a grid of overpriced boxes with granite countertops and zero soul. People listened. Some nodded. A few clapped. But the best part came when Claudia stood up with a folder in her hands and said, "I have documents proving that the new property owner, the one who bought Karen's house, is attempting to acquire the adjacent empty lots to consolidate them for rezoning." That drew murmurs. I let them sit for a moment before speaking again. "We have a choice," I said. "We can stay quiet and hope we're left alone. Or we can push back, legally, peacefully, intelligently. Together." The room was with me. The momentum had shifted completely. And not just because of one bulldozer. It was everything since. The lies. The arrogance. The paper trail she left behind, believing no one would ever be patient enough to follow it. 2 days later, Reggie called. "She's dirty," he said. "The LLC she used isn't properly registered for property holding. She failed to disclose her HOA role in the sale. And get this, she listed the property as vacant land in the deed transfer to avoid capital gains tax. That's felony-level fraud if the county gets involved." I nearly dropped my phone. "You sure? I've got the filings. You want to report it? I've got a contact in the county assessor's office who'll take it seriously." I didn't hesitate. We submitted the full report, complete with screenshots, documentation, and an anonymous tip line confirmation. I even included a copy of Karen's own HOA correspondence where she bragged about restructuring the community's future footprint. By the end of the week, Karen's little scheme started to unravel. The county launched an official investigation into the property transfer. A red flag was placed on any pending construction or zoning requests related to that lot. The new developer, just a front for Karen, was blacklisted from submitting future development plans without full transparency. And Karen herself was summoned for a hearing into potential tax evasion and failure to disclose material information in a regulated sale. She never showed. The last I heard, she'd quietly moved again. This time across the state, to a different HOA community near the coast. I laughed when I found out it was a golf course neighborhood with a strict no lawn ornaments policy. Perfect. Her house, now unsellable due to the investigation, sat vacant. A for sale sign out front bleached white in the sun. Eventually it was auctioned off. One of the neighbors, an elderly woman Karen once cited for painting her shutters, non-neutral beige, bought it at a discount and turned it into a community art studio. I stopped by one day and found her painting a mural of a rooster crowing on a mountain of crumpled HOA violation forms. I asked her what it meant. She smiled and said, "Freedom." And just like that, peace settled in for real. The board meetings became quiet affairs with coffee, homemade cookies, and discussions about potholes and park benches. My barn tours became annual events. Kids played in yards without Karen peering through her blinds. People left their holiday lights up a little longer. No one cared. No one complained. We'd survived Karen. More than that, we'd outlasted her. Sometimes I'd walk past that old lot where she'd tried to dig her culvert, and I'd picture the trench she wanted to carve. Not just in the land, but in the neighborhood. Her version of community was control, compliance, fear dressed in pastel sundresses and policy memos. But our version? Ours was something different. It was barbecue smoke and hammock nap, goats named Pickles and kids riding bikes with glitter streamers. It was a place where nobody needed a bulldozer to be heard, but it helped. And as for me, I stayed president for one more term. Just long enough to cement the reforms, rewrite the rules, and leave behind a structure that couldn't be hijacked by the next clipboard tyrant who came along. Then I stepped down, poured myself a cold drink, and finally did what I'd been trying to do since the very beginning. I sat on my porch, listened to the wind move through the trees, and enjoyed my own damn peace and quiet. The gate? It stayed clear. The pasture? Bloomed greener than ever. And Karen? She never parked across my life again.